Hi guys, today I'm going to be showing you how to make this 3D witch's hat, and we're going to make it in two parts. First we're going to make the rim of the hat, which you're going to need 173 bands, and we're going to be making it on the hook, and then we're going to be attaching it to the loom to make this top part of the hat, and you're going to need 86 bands for that. And you can make stripes or different patterns for the top of your hat if you want. I'm just making it a solid color like this one. I'm actually going to make this exact orange one. So let's get started. To make the rim, we're going to take a single band and I'm going to make a black hat. So I'm looping a single band 4 times on my hook, like that. And then with 2 single bands, I'm going to pull the loops onto my hook, like that. Take 2 more single bands and pulling the loops onto our hook. And this is like making a single chain bracelet on your hook using 2 bands at a time, and we'll do this 20 times. So that's 1, 2, just continue, 3, 4, 5, and I'm going to fast forward till I get to my 20, and go ahead and pause the video until you get to your 20 and come back. So I have 20 loops connected onto my hook like that, and you should count it out. There should be 20 of them. And once you're here, we're going to put our hook through the cap band, and there should be 4 loops. So get the 4 loops of the cap band onto our hook, and it should be flat. It shouldn't be twisted, like that. And now taking 2 single bands on a hook, and we're going to pull all the loops right onto our 2 single bands and make it even. So that's what it should look like. And now we're going to be working with 2 bands for the whole rim of our hat. So taking your 2 bands and pulling the 2 loops onto our hook. And do it one more time. 2 single bands and pulling the 2 loops onto our hook. So we should have put 1, 2, 3 sets of 2 bands after our 20, connecting the cap band onto it. So this is what it should look like at this point. Now with 2 single bands, we're going to put our hook through the 2 loops where the cap band is. Just push it through from the top through, straight through to the bottom, like that. And grab the 2 single bands that's on your finger and pull it through the center of the loops, and then getting the 2 single bands onto your hook, and you should have 8 loops on your hook right now. We're going to take 2 single bands again, getting it on your hook, and then we're pulling all those loops onto the 2 single band. Taking 2 more single bands and getting the 4 loops onto the 2 single bands. So that completes our first set. So that was the first set for our rim for that hole, and we're going to continue the same pattern for each hole around the rim of our hat. I'm going to do a few more with you so you understand. So again, with 2 single bands, we're going inside the next loop. So we're putting a hook from the top and pushing it all the way through to the bottom, and you should see 4 loops on your hook. It should be through the center of that loop there. Push it through, grabbing the 2 black bands and pulling it through and getting it onto your hook, and you should have 8 loops on your hook. Grabbing 2 more single bands, and we're going to pull the 8 loops right onto our 2 single bands, and then getting 2 more single bands and fishing it through and grabbing it onto our hook. So that completes the second set for the brim of our hat, and we're going to continue 18 more times, putting a hook through each of these loops all around to create the brim of our hat. Let's continue to a third hole, taking 2 single bands, putting a hook through the third hole from the top all the way through the bottom, grabbing our 2 single bands and pulling the loops onto our hook. We're back to 8 loops on our hook, getting 2 more single bands and pulling all the 8 loops onto the 2 single bands like that. And to finish this set, taking 2 more single bands and getting that on our loop. Our third set is done. Fourth set, I'm going to repeat just in case you're confused. Taking your 2 single bands, putting your hook through the 4th hole from the top all the way to the bottom, grabbing your 2 single black bands, getting the loops onto your hook, taking 2 single black bands and pulling the 8 loops onto our hook, and then taking 2 more black bands and pulling the loops onto your hook. The 4th set is done, so I'll count with you how many bands you need. So you need 2 initially to go into the 5th hole from the top to the bottom, grabbing our 2 bands, pulling it through, getting on a hook. This is our second set of 2 bands, so we have 4 loops on a hook, and pulling the 8 loops onto our 2 bands and getting it onto our hook. And our last one, our 2 set of band for hole number 5, and pulling the 2 loops onto our hook. So for each hole you should be adding 6 bands. The 6th hole, same thing, we're going to put a hook through the 6th hole from the top to the bottom, grabbing the 2 loops, pulling it up, and getting them on a hook. The second set of 2 bands for hole number 6, getting it onto our hook. The last 2 bands for hole number 6 and getting the loops onto our hook. Now if you have the hang of it, go ahead and finish the rest and pause the video and come back when you're done. If you don't, then I'll continue to do a few more with you. So I'll set out 6 bands so we're not confused. 2, 4, 6. The first 2, we're going to put a hook from the top through the bottom, grabbing the 2 loops, getting it onto our hook. Now we have 8 loops on a hook, grabbing 2 more bands and pulling the 8 loops onto our hook and grabbing the last set of 2 bands and getting the loops on our hook. One more time, we're going to put a hook through the next loop We don't want to put it in the same one, then it'll expand our brim and we don't want that. So we always want to jump to the next hole, put it from the top through the bottom, grabbing our 2 bands and looping it up, getting 4 loops onto our hook, 2 more bands, getting those 8 loops onto the 2 bands, and our last 2 for this hole, pulling it through and onto our hook. And I'm going to continue all the way around till we get to our 20th hole. I'm on my last hole, same thing. I'm going to take my 2 bands, putting my hook through the last 2 loops and fishing my 2 bands, getting them onto my hook and getting the 2 bands and pulling the 8 loops onto my hook like that. And for my last hole, I'm going to stop there with my second set of 2 bands. And now we're going to connect our brim together. We're going to leave the 4 loops on our hook and putting our hook through the 4 loops up on top on the other side of our brim. So you want to put your hook through those 4 loops right there. Get your single band, and we're going to pull our loops over and onto the single band and tie a slip knot. The brim of our hat is done, and tuck in your slip knot band. The brim of the hat was kind of knitting or crocheting, so if you were confused, go ahead and replay the video a couple of times to make sure you get it, and just, it's pretty repetitive, and just watch it over and you should be able to pick it up fine. So that's the brim of a hat, and if you made it a different color, it could also be a sun hat for your Barbie. It should fit perfect around her head. So with your loom in any configuration, we're going to pull the rim of a hat around the 10 pegs. And if you have a monster tail, you can just pull it around the 8 pegs. And it'll be just smaller if you want to use it as a charm. So with the brim of our hat, we're just going to pull it around the 10 pegs on our loom. So that's what it should look like. Just pulling it onto the outside, covering the 10 pegs. And now we're going to loop the inside of our rim onto the 10 pegs. And now I'm going to pull the rim of my hat back, and I see that this loop here is next to that peg, so I'm going to pull it and loop it around that peg, and I should have 4 loops on the outside of my loom right there. So for the next one, same thing, I'm going to find the loops that's near that peg and then pulling the brim of my hat to the center of my loom, and you should have 4 loops on the outside. Go around your loom, pulling the rim back and exposing the hole, and then looping it right to the center of our loom. This is what it should look like. And you should have 4 loops per peg, and the pegs are exposed on the outside. Going around the loom, pulling it back, and I see that hole here is next to that peg, so I'm going to loop it right over it, bringing it to the center, going around my loom. And we only want to loop the hole that's near the center of the rim of our hat. So pulling it back, exposing that hole, and then looping it right onto the peg. And the last one, same thing, pulling it back and looping the rim of our hat onto our loom. So that's what it should look like. Every peg should have 4 loops on the outside, and you shouldn't loop every single band on the rim of the hat, the inside, onto a peg. It should be almost every other one. So now we're going to put the decorative color around our witch's hat, and I'm going to use orange this time, so you can use whatever color you want, and you can even make your witch's hat striped if you want. But I'm just going to make it all black like this one. So taking my decorative color, mine is orange, taking a single band, and we're going to cover the 10 pegs. If you have the monster tail, you're going to use 8 bands going around your loom. Taking your single band, covering our loom, and then we're going to loop the 4 bands up and over and onto those 2 loops. So going on each peg, grabbing those 4 loops that's on each peg and looping it up and over to the center, leaving only 2 loops left per peg. Go around your loom. So that's what it should look like. You should only have the decorative band exposed, and there should be 2 loops left per peg. And let's continue to our next row. Let's continue to our next row, row number 2, taking again our decorative band, single, and looping it around the 10 pegs, and then looping the bottom 2 bands up and over, leaving 2 loops per peg. If you have the monster tail, then your hat just should be pushing through the other side, the back side, but since we don't, we're going to be pulling our hat upwards. So going around each peg, grabbing the bottom 2 bands, looping up and over, push it down, and at this point it's pretty crowded in here, so let's go inside our loom here, the center, and we're going to pull the brim of our hat out. And be careful not to have these bands come off your pegs, otherwise it'll unravel. So very carefully going around your loom. we're going to pull the brim of our hat out. So that's what it should look like, and it should be a lot easier for us to work with now, and we'll just keep pulling it up as we go. So push the bands down. So row number 3 through 6, we're taking a single black band and we're covering the 10 pegs and looping the bottom 2 bands up and over. So I'm using all black. If you're using different colors, you can, to make your hat striped if you want. It's a little tight, just carefully going around your loom, putting a single band and looping it around the 10 pegs. And then looping the bottom 2 bands up and over. So this is row number 3, and I'm going to fast forward, just doing the same process through row number 6. I'm finishing up row number 6, and your hat should be a little looser now, pulling up like that, making sure that these loops does not come off our loom. And if you're working with the monster tail, you shouldn't be having this problem. It should just be all going under your loom. So that was row number 6, and now we're going to reduce to 6 pegs. So we're going to pull a single band off of the 3rd side pegs and moving it onto the 2nd side peg, and we want to pull the band that's attached to the 4th side peg. So take a loop, working on the right side first, off, and check to make sure it's attached to the 4th side peg, and it's not. So I'm going to hold that band and move the other one, which is attached to the 4th side peg, and moving it to the 2nd. And if you're doing the monster tail, you're going to do the same, but you're moving it to the 1st side peg. So that's what it should look like so far. This has 3, this has 1, and we're going to move these 2 loops onto the 3rd side peg. And on the monster tail, you want to move everything to the 2nd side peg. And this one should have 3, and this one should have 3 now after you moved it from here to here. Repeat for this side. I'm going to the 3rd side peg, check to make sure it's attached to the 4th, and it's not. Hold it. I'm going to grab the other band that's attached to the 4th and moving it to the 2nd side peg. Reattaching the one you're holding back onto that peg, and you should have 3 loops on this one and 1 on that one. We're going to move these 2 loops off of the 4th peg and onto the 3rd side peg. And lastly, on this side, we're going to move these 2 loops off of that center peg and moving it in 1 And for the monster tail, you're going to move it to the side peg, the side third peg. So you're going to ultimately come down to 6 pegs. And here on the loom, I'm going to reduce the other side. We have more to do on the loom. So now I'm going to reduce the top side of my loom, and I'm going to take a single band off of the first side pegs that's attached to the center first peg and moving it to the second side peg. So I'm pulling this band off. It's attached to the center first peg and moving it to the side second peg, like that. And then I'm going to pull this loop that's attached to the second side peg and attaching it to the first center peg. So this peg has 4 loops and this has 3. We're going to add another one to this one. Once again, we're pulling a single band off of the first side peg, and it should be attached to the first center peg. Check to make sure, and it is, and I'm moving it to the second center peg, which now has 4 loops, and moving the band off of the side first peg and looping that to the center first peg. And that should have 4 loops. And since it's so stretched out, I'm going to pull it off and attaching it to the center second peg. And make sure you loop all the bands on there. Don't lose any of your loops. And there should be 4 of them, putting them all onto that second center peg. And if you're on the monster tail, you should be on the 6 pegs around your loom, and you shouldn't have to do all of this like we did on the loom. And now for rows 7 through 9, we're going to take 6 single bands covering the 6 pegs and looping the bottom bands up and over. So I'm just taking my single bands, pushing everything down, covering all my pegs around my loom, and pulling, this one has 4 loops, and pulling that up and over to the center, and I have 2 loops left on that peg. Continue around, this one has 3 loops, pulling it up and over to the center, and after you're done you should have 2 loops left per peg. This one has 2, looping it up and over. This one we're looping 3 bands up and over. This one has 4, and this top one should have 4. Pulling all those loops up and over into the center, and push all your bands down, and you should only have 2 loops left on each peg. Row 8 and 9, I'm doing the same thing, taking a single band, covering the 6 pegs, and looping the bottom 2 bands up and over, leaving 2 loops left per peg. I'm going to fast forward through these 2 rows. So that was row number 9, and now we're going to reduce to 4 pegs. And if you're working on the monster tail, this loop here should be on the side 3rd peg or on this side, whichever way you moved it. So now we're going to reduce, taking a single band off of the first side peg and it should be attached to the second side peg, and we're moving it to the first center peg. So getting the loop off, check to make sure it's attached to the side second peg, and we're moving it to the center first peg. So the side first peg should have one loop, and this has two. We're going to move those two onto the first side peg. So now the first and the center peg should have 3 loops on them, like that. Now the center and side first peg should each have 3 loops on them. Let's work on this side. We're going to pull a loop that's on the side second peg, that's attached to the third center peg, or if you're on the monster tail, it's attached to here, and we want to loop it to the first side peg on the right. So grabbing the loop off, and I see that's it's attached to this center peg, and we're going to loop it to the first peg, and this has 3 loops. And now we're going to pull these 2 loops off and attaching it to the right second peg. So this has 3, this has 3 also. So we're down to 4 pegs. Now let's take 4 single rubber bands covering the 4 pegs and looping those bands up and over to the center. So this is row number 10, looping the bottom 3 bands up and over, leaving only 2 loops left per peg. So that's what it should look like right now, and that was row number 10. Row number 11 through 13, we're going to take a single band and we're going to put it around all 4 pegs. So we're taking that single band, stretching it out, getting our hat in the center, and then looping that single band on the 4 pegs. So that's what it should look like. Our hat is in the center, and we'll loop the bottom 2 bands up and over and onto that single band. So you should have only a single loop left per peg. Push it down, and we'll repeat that 2 more times. Taking your single band, stretch it out, get your hat in the center, and then looping it onto your loom and pulling the bottom single up and over to the center like that. Last one, taking your single band, stretch it out, putting our hat through the center of it, push your other bands down and looping that single band around the 4 pegs, and then looping the bottom single bands up and over to the center. And we're almost done, so that's what it should look like. You should have a single band left on each of the 4 pegs. And now we're going to take those loops onto our hook very carefully, not to lose it. So that's what we should have so far. It's inside out. Taking a single band, and we will pull the 4 loops and getting it onto our single band and tying our slip knot. So that's our witch's hat so far, and we're going to flip it, push it in, inside out, inside it out. So there's your witch's hat. I hope you like them. Thanks for watching.